Before I tell you this incredible story, I need you to imagine something. Picture a woman so poor she could barely afford her next meal, yet she gave away her last coins to a stranger in a wheelchair. Now imagine that stranger was actually one of the richest men in the country, disguised and broken in ways money could never fix. What happened next changed both their lives forever, and by the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the poorest among us are the wealthiest in spirit. If you believe in the power of kindness, hit that like button right now, and subscribe to this channel because stories like this one remind us that miracles happen when we least expect them. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Part 1, The Woman Who Had Nothing. Maya Santos had exactly 47 pesos in her pocket. She counted them 3 times as she walked through the crowded streets of Manila, her worn sandals barely holding together. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat trickled down her temples as she made her way toward the public market where she worked as a vegetable vendor's assistant. At 28 years old, Maya had already lived through more hardship than most people experience in a lifetime. Her father had died when she was 12, leaving her mother to raise 4 children alone. Maya, being the eldest, had dropped out of school to help support her siblings. She never complained, never asked why life had dealt her such a difficult hand. Instead, she woke up every morning at 4, worked until sunset, and returned home to care for her aging mother who was slowly losing her eyesight to diabetes. Today was particularly difficult. Her youngest brother, Miguel, needed school supplies for the new semester. Her mother's medication was running low. And Maya's employer had already warned her that business was slow, that he might have to let her go soon. Yet despite all this, Maya walked with her head held high. Her grandmother had always told her that dignity cost nothing, and Maya wore hers like armor. As she turned the corner near Quiapo Church, the smell of incense and candle wax filled the air. Vendors lined the sidewalks selling religious items, flowers, and food. Beggars sat along the church steps, their hands outstretched, their eyes telling stories of desperation. Maya usually walked past them quickly, not out of cruelty, but because she simply had nothing to give. Today, however, something made her stop. There, in the shadow of a crumbling wall, sat a man in a rusted wheelchair. He was different from the other beggars. His clothes, though dirty, seemed to have once been expensive. His hair was unkempt, but his face, despite being covered in grime, had refined features. What struck Maya most were his eyes. They weren't the hollow, defeated eyes she usually saw on the streets. Instead, they burned with something she couldn't quite identify. Anger? Shame? Pain? A cardboard sign rested against his useless legs, "Please help. I have nothing." Something in Maya's chest tightened. Perhaps it was the way he avoided eye contact with passers-by. Perhaps it was the trembling of his hands as he held an empty plastic cup. Or perhaps it was simply that Maya recognized suffering when she saw it. She had lived with it her entire life. Without thinking, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a 20-peso coin. It was almost half of everything she had. Her brother's school supplies would have to wait another week. She would skip lunch for the next 3 days. But as she placed the coin in the man's cup, something unexpected happened. He looked up at her, and their eyes met. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Maya saw surprise flash across his features, followed by something that looked almost like recognition, though she was certain they had never met. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse as if he hadn't spoken in days. "But you shouldn't have. I can see you need this more than I do." Maya blinked, taken aback. No beggar had ever said such a thing to her. "Everyone needs help sometimes," she replied softly. "And everyone deserves kindness, no matter how small." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. If she did, she might take the coin back, and she couldn't live with that guilt. What Maya didn't see was the man in the wheelchair watching her until she vanished from sight. What she didn't know was that her simple act of kindness had just set in motion a chain of events that would transform everything. Part 2, The Billionaire's Disguise. His name was Daniel Cordero, and 3 months ago, he had been on the cover of every business magazine in Asia. At 35, he had built Cordero Industries from a small logistics company into a multinational empire worth over $12 billion. He owned hotels, shipping lines, real estate developments, and tech startups. He had everything money could buy: luxury cars, a penthouse overlooking Manila Bay, a private jet, and more suits than he could wear in a year. But money, as Daniel had learned, could not buy everything. The accident happened on a rainy night in November. Daniel had been driving home from a charity gala, ironically, one where he had donated millions to build hospitals for the poor. His driver had called in sick, and Daniel, impatient as always, had decided to drive himself. He never saw the truck that ran the red light. When he woke up 2 weeks later, the doctors delivered the news that shattered his world. His spine had been damaged. He would never walk again. At first, Daniel refused to accept it. He flew in specialists from America, Europe, and Japan. He tried experimental treatments, stem cell therapy, revolutionary surgeries. Nothing worked. The billionaire who had conquered every business challenge thrown his way could not conquer his own broken body. What followed was a descent into darkness that Daniel never imagined possible. His fiancée, a famous actress named Carmina, visited him exactly twice in the hospital before announcing their engagement was off. His business partners, sensing weakness, began circling like vultures, attempting hostile takeovers. His so-called friends disappeared one by one, their calls becoming less frequent until they stopped altogether. Daniel learned very quickly that his relationships had been built on what he could offer: power, influence, access to wealth. Without the ability to walk, to command a room, to project strength, he was nothing to them. The depression came next. Daniel stopped eating. He refused visitors. He fired his nurses, his therapists, anyone who tried to help. His company began to falter as he withdrew from day-to-day operations, and the board of directors started discussing whether to remove him as CEO. Rock bottom arrived on a cold December morning when Daniel wheeled himself to his penthouse balcony, 32 floors above the ground. He sat there for hours, staring at the city below, wondering if falling would hurt or if it would simply be over in an instant. But something stopped him. Maybe it was cowardice. Maybe it was the memory of his late mother, who had died believing her son would change the world. Or maybe it was simply that Daniel, deep down, still had a flicker of the fighter who had built an empire from nothing. Instead of jumping, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He would become invisible. For weeks, Daniel had been tormented by a question: did anyone in his life actually care about him, or only about his money? He needed to know the answer. And the only way to find out was to remove the money from the equation entirely. So Daniel Cordero, the billionaire, disappeared. He told his most trusted assistant, an elderly man named Roberto who had worked for his family for decades, to handle the business quietly and tell no one where he had gone. He let his beard grow, stopped grooming himself, and dressed in the cheapest clothes he could find. He took his wheelchair, not the expensive motorized one, but an old rusted manual chair that Roberto found in a storage room. Then he went to the streets. For 2 months, Daniel lived among the homeless. He slept in shelters, ate at soup kitchens, and begged for change on street corners. He wanted to see humanity from the bottom, to understand what it meant to truly have nothing. What he discovered broke him in ways the accident never could. Most people walked past him without even a glance. Some looked at him with disgust, as if his disability made him less than human. Children pointed and laughed. Well-dressed businessmen stepped over him like he was garbage. Occasionally, someone would drop a coin in his cup. But they did it quickly, mechanically, never making eye contact, never acknowledging his existence. The message was clear: they were buying the right to feel good about themselves, not actually helping another human being. By the time Maya Santos placed that 20-peso coin in his cup, Daniel had almost completely lost faith in humanity. He had seen enough to confirm his worst fears, that without wealth, he was worthless in the eyes of the world. But Maya was different. She didn't just give him money. She looked at him. She saw him. And her words, "Everyone deserves kindness, no matter how small," pierced through the armor of cynicism he had built around his heart. He watched her walk away, this woman whose clothes were even more worn than his, whose sandals were held together with tape, who clearly couldn't afford to give away a single peso. Yet she had given him 20, and she had given it with grace and dignity. For the first time in months, Daniel felt something other than despair. He felt curious. Part 3, The Search. That night, Daniel returned to his penthouse. Roberto was waiting, as always, with a hot meal and a change of clothes. "You look terrible, sir," the old man said gently. "I feel terrible," Daniel replied. "But also, strangely alive." He showered, shaved, and sat in his study, staring at the 20-peso coin Maya had given him. Such a small amount. Meaningless to him, even now. But to her, it might have been the difference between eating and going hungry. "Roberto, I need you to find someone for me." Over the next week, Roberto coordinated a quiet search. Daniel provided the location, the time, and the description of the woman. Private investigators were hired, CCTV footage was obtained, and slowly, a picture began to emerge. Her name was Maya Santos. She was 28 years old, the eldest of 4 siblings. She worked 12-hour shifts at a vegetable stall in the public market, earning barely enough to survive. Her mother was diabetic and going blind. Her youngest brother was a scholar at a public school, the only one of the siblings who had a chance at a different life. But what struck Daniel most was what the investigators discovered about her character. Neighbors described her as an angel. She helped elderly residents carry their groceries. She tutored neighborhood children for free. She had once given her umbrella to a pregnant woman during a storm and walked home in the rain herself, catching a fever that kept her bedridden for days. This woman, who had nothing, gave everything. Daniel found himself obsessed with understanding her. How could someone so poor be so generous? How could someone with so many burdens still carry the weight of others? In his world, people hoarded wealth, influence, and power. They gave only when there was something to gain. Maya's kindness made no logical sense. He needed to see her again. Part 4, The Return. Maya noticed him immediately when she passed by Quiapo Church the following Monday. The disabled man was there again, in the same spot, but something was different. His clothes were cleaner, though still shabby. His face was washed, revealing features that seemed almost familiar somehow. And he was watching her. Their eyes met, and Maya felt a strange flutter in her chest. She told herself it was nothing, just the anxiety of another difficult week ahead. Her employer had finally let her go, and she was now scrambling to find new work. But still, she found herself walking toward him. "You're back," she said simply. "So are you," he replied. Maya sat down on the church steps near him, ignoring the curious glances from passers-by. "You look better today." "A kind stranger gave me hope last week," Daniel said, and he meant every word. Maya laughed softly, a beautiful sound, Daniel thought. "I only gave you 20 pesos. That's hardly enough for hope. You'd be surprised." They talked for an hour. Daniel was careful to stay in character, to not reveal who he really was. He told her his name was Danny, that he had been in an accident, that his family had abandoned him. The lies came easily because they were built on truth, the truth of how alone he had felt, how worthless his money had proven to be. Maya, in turn, shared pieces of her own story. She talked about her siblings, her mother, her dreams of one day opening a small sari store. She didn't complain about her circumstances. Instead, she spoke about them matter-of-factly, as if hardship was simply part of life, to be accepted and overcome. When Maya finally stood to leave, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wrapped package. "Here," she said, pressing it into his hands. "I made extra this morning. It's just pain de sal, but fresh bread always makes a bad day better." Daniel stared at the bread, his throat tight with emotion. He had eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants around the world. He had sampled the finest cuisines, drunk wine that cost more than Maya earned in a year. But this simple gift, bread baked by a woman who could barely afford flour, meant more to him than any of it. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you so kind to me? You don't even know me." Maya smiled, and for a moment, Daniel saw something in her eyes that he had been searching for his entire life: unconditional compassion. "My grandmother used to say that kindness is the only currency that multiplies when you give it away," Maya replied. "I don't have money, but I have kindness. And I choose to spend it freely." She walked away, and Daniel sat there for a long time, the bread growing cold in his hands, a single tear rolling down his cheek. Part 5, The Crisis. 3 weeks passed. Daniel returned to the same spot every day, and every day, Maya found time to sit with him. They developed a routine: she would bring him food, he would tell her stories, carefully edited versions of his business travels, presented as tales he had heard from others, and they would talk about everything and nothing. Daniel began to realize something that terrified him: he was falling in love with her. Not the kind of love he had felt for Carmina, that had been attraction, chemistry, the intoxication of two successful people feeding each other's egos. This was different. This was deeper. Maya saw him at his lowest, believed he had nothing, and cared for him anyway. She asked nothing in return. She gave without expectation. It was the purest thing Daniel had ever experienced. But fate, as always, had other plans. One morning, Maya didn't come. Daniel waited for hours, growing increasingly anxious. When she finally appeared late in the afternoon, her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "Maya, what happened?" She collapsed onto the steps beside him, her composure finally breaking. "It's my mother. Her diabetes has gotten worse. The doctors say she needs surgery on her eyes immediately, or she'll go completely blind. But the cost." She choked on a sob. "We can't afford it. We can't afford anything." Daniel's heart clenched. "How much?" 400,000 pesos. "I couldn't earn that in 10 years. In Daniel's world, 400,000 pesos was nothing. He spent more than that on a single business dinner. But to Maya, it was an impossible mountain. "There must be a way," he said helplessly, hating the limitations of his disguise. Maya shook her head. "I've tried everything. The government programs have waiting lists that are months long. No bank will give us a loan, we have nothing to offer as collateral. I even thought about—" She hesitated. "There was a man. He offered to help. But his price—" She shuddered. Daniel understood immediately, and rage boiled in his chest. "Don't. Whatever he's offering, don't." "I wasn't going to," Maya said firmly. "Some things are worth more than money. My dignity, my honor, these are things I won't sell. Not even for my mother." She looked at Daniel then, and despite her tears, she smiled. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't burden you with this. You have your own troubles." "No," Daniel said, reaching out to take her hand. It was the first time he had touched her, and her skin was warm despite the cool morning air. "Don't apologize. You've given me so much these past weeks. Let me at least be here for you now." They sat together in silence as the church bells rang overhead, and Daniel made a decision. It was time to reveal the truth. Part 6, The Revelation. But revealing the truth was not as simple as Daniel had imagined. How could he tell Maya that he had been lying to her for weeks? How could he explain that the disabled beggar she had befriended was actually a billionaire playing pretend? Would she understand his reasons, or would she feel deceived, manipulated, made a fool of? More than that, Daniel was terrified of what would happen to their connection. Right now, Maya cared for Danny without any knowledge of his wealth. If she learned he was Daniel Cordero, would her treatment of him change? Would she see him differently? Would she, like everyone else, only see dollar signs? The fear paralyzed him. But Maya's mother was going blind, and Daniel could not stand by and watch it happen. He compromised. That evening, he called Roberto. "I need you to set up an anonymous medical fund. The recipient is Elena Santos. She needs eye surgery immediately. Pay for everything, the best doctors, the best hospital, whatever it takes. And make sure they never find out where the money came from." Roberto, wise and discreet as always, asked no questions. Within 48 hours, Maya received a call from a charitable organization she had never heard of, informing her that an anonymous donor had covered the full cost of her mother's surgery. Daniel watched from a distance as Maya broke down in tears of joy and gratitude at the church steps where they always met. She looked around, as if searching for an angel she couldn't see. "Someone out there is looking out for us," she told Danny the next day, her eyes still swollen from crying. "I don't know who or why, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of this blessing." "You already are," Daniel said softly. The surgery was a success. Maya's mother regained most of her vision, and for the first time in years, the Santos family had reason to hope. But Daniel's deception weighed heavier on his conscience with each passing day. Part 7, The Truth Uncovered. A month after the surgery, Maya's brother Miguel came running to her with news that changed everything. "Ate Maya, ate Maya. You need to see this." He thrust his phone into her hands. On the screen was a news article with a headline that made Maya's blood run cold. "Missing billionaire Daniel Cordero spotted in Quiapo, secret life as homeless man revealed." Below the headline was a photograph, grainy, clearly taken from a distance, but unmistakable. It showed a man in a wheelchair, sitting against the wall of Quiap.